Mark Caro, and welcome to episode 88 of Caropop. Our Caropop guest this week is Eddie King Roeser, singer, songwriter, bassist, and guitarist for the band Urge Overkill. Roeser, who still lives in the Chicago area, spoke with me last week on the 30th anniversary of the release of Urge Overkill's album, Saturation. This was before the death of Urge drummer Blackie Onassis, which was announced June 14th, the day before this episode drops. Our condolences go out to the family and friends of John Rowan, which was Onassis' real name, as well as to Eddie Roeser, Nash Cato, and the rest of the Urge Overkill community. Saturation was this Chicago alt-rock trio's big swing of the bat as it moved to a major label, Geffen Records, after 3 albums for Chicago's Touch and Go label. Produced by the Philadelphia-based duo known as the Butcher Brothers, Saturation sounded crisp and flashy, which matched the band's lounge lizard cool amid a rock scene of drab flannel. The singles Sister Havana and Positive Bleeding all but jumped out of the speakers, and they still do along with the rest of the album. That summer of 1993 was a transformational one for Chicago's rock scene, as Saturation, Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville, and Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream all came out within a 2-month span. Urge Overkill sold a lot of records, but was it enough for the label? Or did the success of Nirvana beforehand and other bands afterward skew the expectations of what constituted success in the rock world? Roeser has a theory about that, as well as memories of being on tour with Nirvana as Smells Like Teen Spirit and the album Nevermind broke through. Did Urge aspire to that level of fame? Roeser and fellow Urge singer-songwriter-guitarist Nash Cato got together while students at Northwestern University. That's where they befriended previous Caropop guest Steve Albini, who produced their first and third albums, Jesus Urge Superstar and the Supersonic Storybook. Powerhouse drummer Blackie Onassis joined the band for Supersonic. Butch Vig, who like Albini would go on to work with Nirvana, produced Urge's second album, Americruiser. Albini became Urge's harshest critic when the band left Touch and Go for Geffen. Have the wounds yet healed between Roeser and Cato and their former friend? Roeser addresses this. He also discusses what it was like for the band to go to Philadelphia on a major label budget to work with Phil and Joe Nicolo, aka the Butcher Brothers. The production duo was known for their work with hip-hop artists such as Cypress Hill and Criss Cross. What was it about that sound that appealed to Urge? Did they get what they were after? What was the creative process like among Roeser, Cato, and Onassis, who sings the song Dropout? How much did the band enjoy trying to live up to the expectations for Saturation? Did they appreciate having to play with Paul Shaffer's band while appearing on Late Night with David Letterman? Was it a good thing that Quentin Tarantino prominently featured the band's cover of Neil Diamond's Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon in Pulp Fiction? Why was Urge's follow-up album, Exit the Dragon, such a dramatic, dark change of direction from Saturation, despite the Butcher Brothers once again producing? What was Roeser's issue with Cato at the time? Why does Roeser sing the majority of the songs on Exit the Dragon and the early albums, but not Saturation? Exit the Dragon turned out to be Urge's last album with Onassis, with Roeser and Cato reuniting to record 2011's Rock and Roll Submarine and last year's We. Will Urge tour again? We'll come around to Eddie King Roeser's way of thinking in this Caropop conversation. So happy anniversary. It's the actual anniversary date for Saturation.
There's a lot of talk of anniversaries around rock music that really people wouldn't have, if you told people back in the day that there would be anniversaries for, people were making records really for the moment. I guess we were hoping for something more timeless, and we lucked out, or we were fortunate enough to have a record that is well known enough to be celebrated some 30 years later.
Yeah, 30 exactly as of today. But it's interesting because I've talked to some people about, did you ever imagine that this, these Pylon records or whatever, would be talked about later? And everyone was always like, no, I never thought about it. But I feel like Saturation actually was kind of one of those albums where you're like, this is built for forever, right? I mean, like you guys, that was a pretty ambitious attempt to make something that was going to last, I would guess.
Yeah. And I will say that, it was a team effort. The guy who had been following our career grew up in LA, and he was a DJ, and he had a pretty eclectic taste, and he was DJing in like raves in LA, and he really knew what was going on, and he loved Brian Eno, and he literally went and found us when you couldn't buy a Moog synthesizer or nobody wanted Fender Rhodes pianos. Our A&R guy found somebody who hoarded these things and shipped them to the studio for us.
Nice.
And he's like, you need this, this is what's on the, this is what's on the, album. And we, as you can tell, there are some pretty obvious uses of Moog synthesizer and Fender Rhodes piano on the record.
Right.
And they're just like brand new toys that we, I think, used judiciously. And it can be dangerous for a band like us to get a new toy because it can lead you astray. But I think we had enough people around to not overuse it, I hope. There had been one song with a synthesizer on it as sort of a joke. Now that's the Barklords. It was a sort of an homage to sort of cheap tricks sort of joke. We joked about their overuse of keyboard on some famous songs that they had, that even now Rick Nielsen is like, well, I like the live version of Surrender better because I hate those keyboards I put on the studio version. What was I thinking? When you talk about saturation, we were really have always been, but we were sort of especially into Cheap Trick at that time, and kind of how their backup vocals were, the whole thing. It was, when I think about saturation, I think about being how we sort of ripped off Cheap Trick at a couple of points. And we were very excited to tell them about it, but we did. That was about when they were doing, they were just kind of coming out of one of their darker phases and were back in the limelight. And they played, I think, a series of their records at Park West during the time when we were recording Saturation. Of course, that was done over a series of weeks where we went out to Philadelphia, which was a new city to us, of course. But
right,
that was a pretty weird
home of the Butcher Brothers. Your producer.
Yes, the Butcher Brothers, kind of a example of sort of marketing that the two didn't really team up on a lot of things, but they called themselves the Butcher Brothers just because that was they were both studio owners, and one of them was primarily rock, and one of them was pretty deep into hip hop and was working with Cypress Hill, or he was helping DJ Muggs, who was a pretty brilliant beat maker. Spent a lot of time in that studio, so we had all of the techniques, the things that were brand new at the time that we didn't know how to work an MP3 or it's called an MPC3. It's that machine that they used to make hip hop on before computers. But the Butchers had one and could use it like clockwork. So they were able to translate any of our sort of ideas, and they actually pushed that kind of stuff on us in a way that I think was beneficial. Just playing around, having fun.
So it's actually Phil and Joe Nicolo. So they were into branding like you guys were. So they which one? It's like Phil and Joe Necro, but it's Phil and Joe Nicolo. Which was the rock guy, and did he end up working more with you, or did they kind of split it?
Phil was more the rock guy, and he actually came when we got in and decided that we were going to work with them. We decided we needed to equip ourselves over at the bank where the band's hideout, as it were. We had a full basement in this bank building in Humboldt Park. We decked it out with a cheap studio, and Phil came from Philadelphia to help us set up the studio, and we recorded over a few days. He helped us produce and taught us how to sort of run this 8-track setup, which some of those, the results of that are actually pretty much unchanged, are on the album. For instance, Stalker is with a couple of vocals on top and some noise things. That was recorded in the basement. That was recorded in Chicago by us.
Okay.
and that was recorded by Blackie and myself. Actually, Phil had gone, but he taught us how to use the studio. So he was more the rock guy, and I think they both grew up with the Beatles and fascinated by most guys who own studios or back then would have similar stories as to how they figured out. It is documented pretty well if you know where to look, how this was recorded or how that was recorded if you look into the Beatles catalog. And those guys were lucky enough to have similar equipment. The Neve sound, or the board, the when people talk about the sound of those 60s recordings, they had a big board that was called a Neve. That was, it looked like the control panel of a nuclear submarine. I mean, everything was huge. They're modular, so you can take the modules out and fix them. And one of those modules now is worth like $50,000. So they're people have taken them apart and used them just to some people would rather have one of those than 50 tracks, 50 channels of, mediocre electronics. But anyway, I'll never forget this. And I can't believe he did this, or it was a hallucination, but he's like, I'll show you how tough this board is, like how strong these Neve boards are. And Phil got up on top of the thing and kind of jumped up and down with his shoes on. And I'm like, dude, you don't have to prove that to us, but that was how sort of bad it worked.
He could have just said, I could jump up and down, like, but he actually did jump up and down.
It's indestructible. And yeah, not really. You don't want to jump on the faders. It's indestructible, but it's also extremely valuable. At the time, this was before, we knew how quickly even having a tape machine was going to become expensive. But they had the best technology at the time was still considered 2-inch tape. And, basically that was the end of the days when most major label stuff was recorded on tape. And it's, as people may or may not know, it's similar to the film business where you're always rewinding, reloading the tape, sending the tape is the tape boxes are about twice as heavy as they look. So people are lugging tapes around and they're like lead because they're what's the metal that it's iron oxide. So when you pick up a tape, it's twice as heavy as it should be.
Right.
That added all these costs to. That's why records were so expensive, and it was quickly democratized when you could make a record on a computer that sounded pretty good. That probably wasn't technically possible in 1992 yet when we recorded Saturation. And there's no question that the sound of when studio geeks talk about the Neve sound or whatever, it's the sound of that saturation. Like, for instance, 90210, there's only one guitar, there's a bass. You can really hear the air around it, and everything has this honeyed, just pleasant sound to it that just pricks up your ears. That's the Neve sound. And I guess to this day, the guy who does sound for Cheap Trick, and this is a common thing where they used to use Steely Dan's Asia to tune the PA system before a live show. A lot of guys, talk about what song they use. And to this day, Cheap Trick used Sister Havana to tune.
Oh, nice.
Proudly, I'm very proud to say. And so that's a thing. If you can get your song in the pantheon of, the song that sound guys want to hear to use the PA, you did a mix right. And that is one of my proudest talking points, I've got to say.
So you'd done 3 albums at that point. You'd done Jesus, Urge, Superstar, Americruiser, and The Supersonic Storybook. You had the EP Stall, and then you get signed to Geffen. Did you have these songs or some of these songs around already? Did you and Nash and Blackie have a sense of this is what this album is going to be? Or did you sort of start off like, okay, now we have to write our big label album and, the rules have changed and we're going to do this sort of thing now?
I'd say number 2. We didn't get signed on the strength of some demos that we did or said to Geffen. That the guy who signed us there had been aware of the band for quite a while, and based in LA, it took him a few years to find us and track us down. Apparently, it was back in the day when you couldn't just. It was. When he finally hooked up with us, he's like, I've been meaning to sign you guys for a while, and he knew everything about the band and had some ideas about what he would like to hear. And I think a lot of his ideas, in terms of if we only had a routine use of some of these synthesizers and things like that, it might be fun. The album came to fruition after we were signed and we knew kind of who we were going to work with. There were a couple songs that were jammed on in soundcheck, and one of them was basically just the riff for Sister Havana was something that we had around, and I remember jamming on that. With that basic riff is basically kind of a Boston riff backwards or whatever. You don't want to think too hard about it. I mean, every song is another song, or that there's only so many combinations that rock, right?
Right.
If you disqualified every song that sounded like another song, you wouldn't have any songs.
You wouldn't have Smells Like Teen Spirit if you didn't have Boston either. I mean, if you're gonna draw a connection.
Yeah, you can't.
But so what? It's a different song.
Well, I remember jamming on that in a sound check, and it was in between. I think Chris Novoselic was up there too, and I think Nash started playing and he got on the bass. I was backstage or something, and I heard this riff, and I remember Novoselic saying, "That's your hit, you guys. That is a great riff. I can't stop playing this." So we had that riff before we were signed to Geffen. But
that's when Urge was touring with Nirvana.
Yeah. We had a tour with them that had been set up for a while in the US. At the time, this is probably something people know, but Geffen were kind of hoping that Nirvana could maybe be as big as Sonic Youth, and that was going to be a big success,
Right.
So I don't know, something around 100,000 records or something like that. And they didn't even really have Teen Spirit until towards the end. They were going to come out with Come As You Are, which is great, but it wouldn't have had the same franticness that Teen Spirit created. This franticness, which happened as we were on tour with them. Just about when the record came out, we had started on a tour of the Midwest. And I remember we were playing in Columbus, Ohio, was the first gig. And Urge and Nirvana were basically about sort of co-headliners. It was sort of like, Nirvana, if anything, we were a little better known in Columbus than Nirvana was. And those guys watched us play. And Chris says later that, I know at the time we were a trio, and we were pretty darn tight, and those guys definitely felt they were put on notice coming on after us. But in about 2 or 3 weeks, this thing happened where people were showing up because of MTV, people were showing up at these concerts, and they couldn't get in, and they would sell every T-shirt they had on them. And it just happened really fast. It was like touring with the Beatles in those movies, you see. There was a frenzy around the band that I can't imagine. I can understand how jarring that could be to one's life, to just be this band that's on the level of all the other bands. And then all of a sudden, there was nothing else no one else in our community really had that type of fame or frenzy around them, except for the Chili Peppers, who'd been working at it for years. They were, they came by their hugeness, honestly, and had been touring like crazy for years.
Right.
And I guess the other band that was starting to get pretty big was Soundgarden. But besides that, there was none of these type of grunge bands were, MTV was help making it happen, but there were some bands that were not legitimate that we didn't think were great, that were mixed in there where nobody could tell the real thing from the not great fare that was maybe on MTV. But MTV had a huge pull at that time. And within the 2 weeks we were on tour with Nirvana, they went from a band that was about as well known as Urge, fairly unknown, to a worldwide phenomenon where people were at the show and they didn't know why. They was just like they started to see frat guys, and it upset the band. By the time we did a round, and by the time we got to St. Louis, they were like these, they called them jocks showing up at the show and, bouncing along with the song that was on the radio and they were sort of like, wow, kind of not what we signed up for. Like that feeling of like, I know you like my music, but I how can I let it be known that I don't like you? It did, I think, Kurt, I think, developed sort of a feeling of like, yeah, I didn't get into this to make some frat guy jump up and down. And it, that's easy to come down on somebody to say, well, that's what success is like. You don't think that far ahead. And I think that jarring sense of like, these people who are strangers to what we are doing are showing up in mass droves just like that. And it was it was some amazing, the energy made for some of the most amazing rock shows I've ever seen. So I don't know if you've seen, Nirvana are a great band. I saw them at the Uptown with like 6 people, and they're so powerful, it's almost scary. And like, it's almost like they repelled the audience. It was so ferocious. But when you have, 3,000 mindless kids jumping up and down, and the band being so well oiled, at that point, they were, probably played with more ease than any band I had seen, or at least the singing. Usually we're not, touring around. You don't think, we're touring with touch and go type bands like the Butthole Surfers, the Killdozer. It's like the technology wasn't such that the vocals could be the center of your show. But Kurt's voice, I'll never forget how that cut through as really being something special. And he was always able to do that, however bad the PAs were and all that. So some of the anthemic qualities, or maybe a couple of the tempos, I think we could say that we use the experience of touring with Nirvana to sort of say, well, this kind of a groove gets things going. We had done records that were pretty eclectic and done sort of without the sense for, okay, we're going to have to get on stage and play these songs, and is this going to work? We usually just kind of recorded whatever we at the last minute had ready and worried about it later, where there was some conception in making Saturation that, yes, these are going to take the stage and they're going to have to fill a room. We had done our, by necessity, more eclectic music, and the sort of eclecticism of Urge, or the fun, went into the interstitial parts of it, which was an important and I think highly enjoyable part of the record. that you kind of can't fake. If you're trying to do it because it's an idea, it's very hard to fake that interstitial things they stuck in. And that was sort of the Butcher Brothers did that sort of as an act of love, and that to show that how much fun they were having is like they made those little things in between the songs for us just to make us smile. We didn't really author those interstitial things where it's, we talk about, I think we came up with, we wanted Hawaii 5-0 in there, but the sort of the recording, like they sort of recorded Nash making a couple jokes and put the music behind it, Mary Tyler Moore. That was the stuff they did at night. We didn't see that stuff until, Joe would came in and say, yeah, I was up pretty late last night. And I got a little present for you guys. And put on this loop of Mary Tyler Moore and Nash, in his goofy voice saying, they recorded at the big leagues. And that was just sheer fun. And it was a real positive. Recording records, it either goes really great or it's no fun and you're kind of starting to plod along. And this one, we got up on the right foot right away. There is huge pressure when you're hiring a producer and moving from the touch and go way of doing things to the, whatever, Geffen way of doing things. In our case, there was no pressure or there were no asks from the label. Usually that comes later when you're done with the record. They're like, oh, you have to go back, and that never happened with us, but it was a common thing that would happen. And we had a demo of Sister Havana. I think we did Bottle of Fur. When Phil came and we recorded about half of the songs in the basement, and I think a couple of them remain unreleased, but nothing really great there. But you could tell, something really good could come out of this. We had a weekend booked in Philly to just see how it was going to work. I think it wasn't a concrete plan like this is going to happen. We came up with 90210, which is, partially. We had the brand new keyboard, and it was a last minute thing where we were writing the lyrics. We had a van, and we put our gear in the van and finished the song 90210 on the way to driving to Philadelphia. And we got there, and they thought we were gonna rock out and try to do this thing, and we thought we would throw them a curveball and do a ballad. And where you can really hear that shows the sound of the studio, and it's easier to not fake it when you have a softer song. That just came through, basically it was about a day and a half. We were there and we had this brand new song, 90210, that was pretty sparse, but they worked with us with there's a Beatles trick in it where you run the tape backwards and do the hi-hat goes shoo, shoo, and all these sorts of major changes in the song that are subtly bringing in another instrument. They were so psyched to work with a band that had, I guess, the aesthetic to want to do a record that sounded produced. And that was very much not the thing. They were recording grunge bands, and there was a running studio. They had to work with whoever came in, and they'd been doing a lot of hip hop. So they were dying to work with some music outside of the box, right? Where you bring a real, you're recording guitars and stuff. They weren't known for producing bands that used actual instruments. And they were as excited as we were about, we're not going to pretend this is a live recording. This is like a well-produced, well-thought-out thing. And we took way more time than we'd ever taken in putting on one song to make 90210 happen. And I remember we were coming back in the van a couple of days later, just amazed at the sound, at what we did. There were things on it that we probably wouldn't have thought of, but these guys as producers, there are some tricks in it, but they're very much studio retro, nothing gag-like about it. I mean, I feel like it comes off as a really tasteful thing. We're like, man, we did this without even really trying. It was just the trial run.
Right.
And we got 91210. It's like, it's amazing. And even the guitar is, the guitar is like slightly out of tune, but that was the take that had the most feel. And they insisted, and most studio guys cannot have that. They're like, our reputation is on this. We cannot have an out of tune guitar on, this first track we're doing. And they're like, no, you're going to keep that guitar in there because that's the right one. And I always, whenever I hear that, I'm sort of reminded of, that was another call that they helped craft the song and helped us not put too much stuff on it.
What was the songwriting process with you guys? Like, would you each sort of come in with a song and help finish each other's songs? Or was it more like you're in a room together, kind of coming up with stuff together?
We didn't have writing sessions, I guess. We spent a lot of time at the bank getting high or whatever. And when inspiration took hold, at least we could have a place to lay things down and record things. But we had a pretty unofficial way of doing things. For a lot of the tunes, it would be maybe a first part, and part of the second part would either be me or Nash would have that and just kind of take it to the band. And then finally, at the end, you work on the vocals and the lyrics. And we kind of did all that together. Often the lyrics are kind of finished writing in the studio. We're kind of tossing around things at the last minute because that's some songwriters start with the lyrics and all that, but we didn't really have that. Nash did have the sort of story behind 90210, or the concept behind it with the idea, and that sort of actually came to him he was sitting on a hillside in LA with an acoustic guitar, and he did come up with most of it, but the refining of the ideas and the exact way the vocals went, that was up to the very last minute. That song was never demoed. That song was never played until we talked about it in the van all the way up. And so we didn't have anything to play them. And we're like, okay, we're going to start recording the song. Usually you show up to a big studio and you've got 5 demos of every song. You've been working on it. And they trusted Urge enough, and we didn't really have that much preparation. One of the reasons the stuff sounds fresh is because it hadn't been done to death. Now, some of the other more songs that we had before had been demoed once. And most people, I think, if you're signed to a company, they make you demo the hell out of stuff, or at least that was how I understood that. The labels had enough juice to push bands around. And I think when we did our labeling thing, we knew that Sonic Youth had the very wide open, they had complete, executive control, and Nirvana was able to get that. And we were able to get that from Geffen, which is a reason that we didn't sign for twice as much money for some other label. We were offered huge amounts of money on other labels without that control cause, I believe. And we sort of felt like we trusted, again, it was more Sonic Youth's label than Nirvana's at the time. And our side of it wasn't the DGC. We actually worked with a guy who had nothing to do with the Sonic Youth crowd. It was a guy who had been working with their other side, which was more, they put out some metal records. So our guy was sort of an assistant for that guy John Kolodner for a while. When Geffen got into the hair metal stuff. He was a guy who's been around all these famous metal recordings and apparently dresses like a wizard.
Okay.
Yeah.
He should.
He's the wizard guy, and our A&R guy, who's very much not like that, who was more of a record collector, like DJ guy, was, I guess, his musical knowledge did enough to impress him. But that was our guy. So we had a real champion at that label. And you can't always and never trust, what people are going to say that, oh, they love your band and they've been following it all. But we had enough on this guy to know he knew enough about our music to have actually cogent things to say about it. And one of the reasons we ended up on that label and to have the sort of positive start we did in the world of whatever major label recording was that we made that choice, and we made some sacrifices that were to do with, are we going to have control of our music or not? Because sure enough, we'd heard of a lot of horror stories, and it's true. At the time, there were many a band who would go in and record their record, and if they didn't like it, it could just sit and you could have your record never released. That was a common thing to have in record contracts. Like, this doesn't have to come out. And I think we made pretty major financial sacrifices to not have anything like that in our contract. And at the time, it ended up being, for our band, it was great. And I can't imagine anything like Saturation coming to be without those two particular guys and that studio and that environment. It just was a one-time deal with we didn't know those guys, and we probably would have recorded the record with Butch Vig if it hadn't been for the DJ or our A&R guy saying, let's really try something interesting. And I don't think that would have been the greatest idea for us. When we did record a record with Butch Vig, he did have a lot of crazy and great ideas on it. It's Americruiser. It's
right.
It's just enough to be an LP, but it's really an EP. It's I don't know how much music is on it, but we did have limited time, and he did have a lot of great ideas in a similar way in terms of experimenting and going for the craziest ideas we wanted to do. The fortuitous event was kind of writing a song and not having a demo or an idea of where this song was going to go, to show up at their studio and to sort of come out with this, kind of magical recording. To us, 90210 was sort of a self-revelatory thing. It overshot our expectations for what we were going to get out of that weekend. And it was not going to be like a single on the record, but it really showed how we could work together, and this could be really fun, inspirational, and easy.
It's your album closer.
There was some ease to it. And these guys are, they're sort of urban Philly guys who they'd been dealing with their studio in a pretty rough part of town for years. It was basically in this nasty basement. And, they had been doing things the same way for years. And we showed up, and they had their pizza place and their hoagie place, their place that had the Philly steak sandwiches and all that stuff.
Got to get your cheesesteak.
It was a whole thing where we kind of stepped into this, pretty urban environment, which wasn't our, we weren't unfamiliar with it, but in terms of being around guys who actually facilitated hip hop and had been doing that as their bread and butter was really fun, because they were kind of sick of it. And we wanted to maybe work with somebody who wasn't bored to tears. Being a recording engineer is a grind, and it's a bunch of guys playing the same, if you're if you have a good business, you're going to have a lot of people coming in there. It's maybe not that exciting, but they were as excited as we were to interface with these total freaks that they would have never met before. It creates several triangles of influence between when you have sort of two producers who all have different skills and have good ideas. And then the three of us, I think, created things, and it gave those guys time to, maybe when we were in doing, vocals take a long time, they didn't both have to be there. Phil would help us sit all night and do vocals. Joe would be at home, chopping together one of those interstitial things, or working on some funny or working on the beat. He actually helped us with the beat for
Dropout.
Yeah. So that worked out really well too. And that's usually not a great thing, where unless they're brothers and are used to working together, like a co-producer thing, it can create problems with who's really the boss.
Right.
And they had a pretty good way of working, and they didn't need us. They were like, Joe was remixing some Stings. He had the tape from Roxanne. He had some contract with Sony. They were sort of working with us kind of for fun. It was a side. They were just fine. They were not concerned about, oh, is Gavin going to like it? Or in fact, we actually, actively fucked with the A&R guy, where we recorded, a joke track back in the day when you could have a hidden track at the end of a CD. There is one on Saturation.
Right. Yeah. Like 20 minutes in or something like that. Yeah.
So the first time the A&R guy came in, so we recorded what we thought was like the worst song, like the most unpalatable song you could record. And we had him come in like totally straight face, nobody broke character. We're like, kind of working on a new direction for this record. And we played Operation Kissinger for him, like for real. And he totally didn't get the joke. I could tell he started sweating, and he's sort of like, oh my God, this is a disaster. And we let him sort of stew in it for a while. We're like, we fucking totally got you. It was one of those, you should have seen your face things. Right. Because if you listen to Operation Kissinger, it is terrible. And it doesn't sound like Urge or anything. And
that's why it's hidden.
We were hoping he could say, oh my God, this is terrible. What's wrong with you guys? But in true A&R session fashion, he's like, he wasn't going to say that in front of us, apparently. He's like, in fact, he was speechless.
Well, but there you go.
That was a funny part of that's where that came from. The hidden track was our attempt to really frighten our A&R man.
There you go.
And I think it did.
Well, you got Kissinger in the title, so that's a good giveaway. When you went into making this record, by the way, did you know like which songs Nash was gonna sing and which ones you were gonna sing, and like what the balance of those was gonna be?
I don't think we were done enough to have things divvied up like that. We didn't end up with extra songs or too many tracks that didn't make it on there, but it's sort of like, may the best tune win. We tried to just construct the thing that was going to be the best. At the time, we had some techniques, because back in the day, if you had a song that you could both sing on or kind of do a co-lead vocal, we had sort of developed doing a lot of that. A couple of the songs have both King and Nash vocals.
Tequila Sunday has that.
Yeah, and that's what we just in the era of like trying to get as much vocal presence in the live show, we tried to both be singing as much as possible. There was no extra songs really to plan out. Oh, is this balance right? Or it worked itself out naturally. It was a surprise that there was a Blackie vocal. I think he went in one night with one of the guys who was helping. There was a guitar tech there were, I'm going to say probably drugs involved, but he showed up in the morning with this pretty good, pretty done version of this tune. We're like, wow, that's a good song. We've got to put it on the record.
It's a keeper.
It was kind of a surprise. Yeah. That wasn't a plan. Like, oh, yeah, the drummer will go the song too. He just sort of up and did it. And good for him.
Like Exit the Dragon and some of the earlier albums, you'll have maybe more of the lead vocals. Saturation, Nash has more of the lead vocals. Is there a competitive aspect to that between the two of you? Or is it really like that's just how it worked out on this record versus this record?
That's just how it worked out, obviously. I mean, we've always been able to kind of balance that stuff out without a lot of ill feeling. I think everyone wants to have, if you're a songwriter, you want to hear your stuff and you want to hear your voice and stuff like that. But I remember, during that time where I had some damage from singing, over singing so much. And in our touring, when the band started out, I used to sort of sing a lot more. And my voice was just kind of not as durable. So I think, Nash kind of has one of those voices where he can smoke all night and he can sort of, or did, but, and I sort of was going through a thing with my vocal where it was, I had a sort of a medical issue at not a great time. So I was less interested in pushing my stuff, and probably during the time of Saturation, I probably wasn't as in great of a shape to sing vocals. And then, with the next record, it sort of happened where Nash wasn't or didn't come with as many tunes that we thought were going to make the grade as I did. And it just so happens, maybe on the next record, that's always how it's been, at the beginning, it's a tough thing to have this kind of, if you will, Lennon-McCartney thing of like, who's the singer and it doesn't always work. And in the case of Urge, I think it did work. And most bands just can't withstand that type of delegating, in the end, I think we certainly wouldn't have been as interesting of a band, but I think not having a lead singer made Urge, like the Beatles, maybe more interesting and maybe led to a quicker demise than it's not easy to sustain that.
Right.
The bigger you get, the more people get confused by that. It's just one of those things that I have to sort of say that the things that make Urge interesting or why anyone's listening today are exactly the same as they had to happen in a certain way. And we have multi vocalists and we have multi everything. If we were able to be like Weezer and find a sound and fucking pound it into the ground, that's really the ultimate thing you want to do with rock band. Is like, it's unrecognizable. That's guided by voices. Urge isn't like that. I guess we accepted that long ago, but you see these other bands sort of that have one sound. It really makes it easier, but we've never been about making things easy. In fact, if there's some way we could fuck up the expected thing that a band would do, that was sort of our stock in trade, is to do what you're not supposed to do.
Did you guys always see it as like the power of three, and having it a trio as opposed to having four people?
We did utilize that power of three, and I think had it been possible for us to remain a three-piece and still grow, I enjoyed that dynamic a lot more. But sort of being a guitar player, and I'm sort of coming up with stuff that Nash sort of can't really cover. It's multiple part stuff. We sort of drifted into just sort of saying, well, I got to be on guitar too, because these parts are so important. But that also was, I think, an unfortunate transition in the band when and I'm going to say we couldn't go out as a three-piece and convincingly do the songs on Saturation. We didn't think about that at the time, but we had already started to go out with extra guitar player before we recorded that, I think. But originally we did have we did have a guitar player, and I played bass, and that didn't seem to make as much sense as me playing my parts on guitar, and hiring a bass player is easier. But that was the original idea, was a trio. And there is a power in that. And I really love that. And I think it's just one of the, are you going to have Saturation or not? We sort of decided that our sound was we needed more of like a Cheap Trick type. Of course, there's one singer in Cheap Trick, but it just wasn't going to work with one guitar. And That's just an aesthetic choice that we made. I think it did, upset. Every band changes. But you do bring up a cogent point there, where we went kind of from a trio that everybody knew to three guys, and there's a fourth guy playing bass, and we always found some character. Either they were like a pal of ours, or we found this guy Chuck Trees. He was hanging around the studio, and we got to be pals with him. He's a talented drummer, and he's a multi-instrumentalist, and we didn't want to get stuck flat-footed. So we asked him pretty early on in the making of Saturation, did you ever want to go on the road with Urge? And he was very excited about that. He went out on our Saturation tours and joined us at the bank, and, who knows what kind of scars he bears these days from that, but I haven't been in touch with him.
I remember seeing you guys play Positive Bleeding on Letterman. And of course, Letterman, they would make you play with their whole band. So you got Blackie on the congas while it's Paul Shaffer and his band, and then, the two of you as well. Was that fun to do that, or was it annoying that they made you play with their band?
It might have been a situation, I'm not positive about this, where if there was ever a band that could make the most of playing with Letterman's band, it probably was Urge, and having Blackie on the congas, because there is a strong conga track on the record, on the
Absolutely,
song.
yeah.
And that just the visuals of it are great. And we might have tried it with Blackie with the drum kit. I don't know. It depended on how much juice you had, I think. There's like Paul is the music director, and I think he sort of maybe made the call like, look, we've got 5 minutes. This way isn't working. We're gonna have Anton play the drums. And I think it was something that was kind of a last minute thing. I don't know if that was when we showed up at Letterman and we knew what was going to happen.
It sounded well rehearsed.
Well, those guys can play anything. They just need to hear it once. It's incredible. It wasn't rehearsed. It was more like, I think we were trying to do it, and it just wasn't, we hadn't been in the game of playing as a 4-person without the monitor. You're in a TV studio. I think it was the quickest way to make sure we were going to get a great performance. I think we all ended up being pretty happy, and it did bring us some benefits because the band did play and learn Positive Bleeding. They loved the tune, and they wanted to play on the tune. They thought it makes them look cool. And Paul continued to play Positive Bleeding for years on the run-ins, but sometimes when they come back in from rehearsal, for years, they were playing Positive Bleeding. And I'm like, okay, well, that's one plus of having the band actually have learned it and played it. They got to enjoy it. I guarantee if we didn't have like Anton and the band playing along with us, they would never have bothered with it.
There you go. Was this whole process of having the album come out and all of the expectations and playing these late night shows and other shows and concerts and everything, was it fun overall, or was it also nerve-wracking, or all of the above?
It was fun, and it was also just kind of scary because you don't expect the stakes to ever get that high. I mean, until Nirvana became what they became, there was nobody I knew who could manage to buy a house or several houses just from playing guitar or, playing drums in a band. I mean, we didn't hang out with people like that. The stakes were not to the point where it's like, this is going to like really change my life. That really messes with you because you just want to, you're doing this thing for no stakes. You're like, I'm in this band. I'm going to be playing to 100 people or 6 people. We're doing it. I know in movies they talk about the stakes, but it really does mess with, what's going on in the back of your mind. And when the stakes go up, yeah, you're more nervous and you might need to take more of whatever it is you take to take the edge off. And thus the cycle goes like that. It's in every behind the music ever made. It's like that's because the stakes change, people change, and things can happen that aren't great. And some people make through it. Some people are now dead because of it, I think. There were moments of incredible fun and a lot of laughter. I know that we've toured with a lot of bands that have maybe considered it a grind and had not been talking to each other and were just kind of doing it. Once that was the case with Urge, we were like, we're not going to do this. I know there are bands that do this, and most of them do this, where they would rather be doing anything else than being on stage with this band that they've kicked it out with for 30 years. But I think having that trio aspect of it was, it was us three against the world for the longest time. And the fun was really indescribable. I mean, I thought there was more laughs in the Urge band than just about any other band you could find. Mm-hmm. And everybody wanted to hang out with Urge, and that's where the fun was. I mean, that's how we got our tour with Nirvana and Pearl Jam. They took us out when they were probably the biggest band on earth for a bunch of shows, and we had a lot of fun with them too. And I did grow to respect them as players.
Were you guys affected by the, sort of backlash coming from Chicago, Wicker Park scene, and like, oh, they left Touch and Go, and, Steve Albini complaining about it publicly? Did that stuff affect you, or were you just kind of like, come on?
Having been so sort of deeply involved with Steve that it was, it was kind of a cloud hanging over, it was hard to just ignore that there was this I mean, look, if you're big enough to get a backlash, and that's more than we could ever hope with, that somebody cares enough to be complaining about how we're conducting ourselves in a publication, that's rock music. Some of it was, I think, more painful because at least myself and Nash and Steve were pretty good friends, actually. And we had a lot of laughs together. And Steve has a very specific rules of engagement for music. Is like, thou shalt not make music to make money for one's career. It should be, punk rock is a habit and an attitude and a lifestyle, and professional musicians suck. At that time, that was a legitimate thing that many people could throw at somebody like us, saying, who do you think you are? You want to use punk rock to make money, which is, no, we were into music and back rec and the tradition of entertainment and rock and soul and all this stuff. I think it was a misreading of what Steve never stepped out of being a punk, but we never promised anybody that we were 100% DIY or whatever. And I think in some ways, because of the label, Corey and Steve kind of shared this sense of, they basically didn't do publicity. Like, if you're not cool enough to find our label, fuck you. We don't need you. And it was literally, they successfully did that. And Corey did, I think, due to we'd been working working with Beth Weiner, who actually went in there and said, Corey, you gotta hire somebody to make people know about your music. And he actually did change, and he did hire a couple of people, and I think it helped his label. It wasn't always a flat no. We begged for money to make a video, and we broke them down, and we made this video for nothing. It was far out ski, and it was really goofy and funny and fun, but it helped build the Urge, and Urge ended up, because I think he did have sort of a change of heart due to our influence, to just be a little bit more customer friendly. And, Touch and Go is probably thrive. They probably did better on Urge than anybody else. And, so in the end, we got the last laugh, I guess. And we were very fortunate to have worked with Touch and Go, but there was a bizarre kind of I guess they would call it careerist or whatever. You're familiar with the term. What is it? Selling out. That was like, yeah, if somebody convinced you somebody said you're selling out, it didn't feel good. I mean, that's not what we felt like we were doing, but that was a legitimate criticism you could throw at people. And yeah, it did hurt, and it was unfair.
Well, and it's coming from where you came from. It's like having your family complain about you. So yeah, that's going to affect you for sure.
That's the thing. It was more than it was coming from former friends. So yes, it's still smarts.
Was there any fence mending down the road over these last 30 years, or is it still like that's just sort of where it ended up?
Well, I think with Corey, we're definitely are good. Corey Russ, the owner of Touch and Go, he's moved out of Chicago, but in the end, we still work together on licenses, and he re-release our records, and he's, I think, has moved on. But in terms of Steve, we don't, we haven't really discussed it since we sort of fell out of. This has happened between Steve and a lot of people, if you care to know the truth. And I, to this day, I have to say, Steve is the guy who was very generous to our band. He needed a band to learn how to run the studio, and we were sort of around. He had a job at least, and he paid for our early recordings and selflessly worked for hours and hours with a bunch of stoned idiots to make it into something great. I'm not gonna begrudge the guy for that. There aren't a lot of people who, I guess, can afford to stick to their, principles. But I know a lot of people who are a lot lower on Steve than I am, because they weren't there when he did what he did to help our band.
When you guys finished Saturation and you finished touring for it, and then you did Exit the Dragon 2 years later, also with the Butcher Brothers, what was the mindset going into that one compared to Saturation?
Well, there had been a huge change, and all I can say is, yeah, that there'd been, we all had enough, I guess, finances to spend some more time apart. So we didn't sit around, Saturation was before anything had happened, and we had spent all this time sort of preparing for sort of before the storm. And the next record was kind of after the storm, and everybody was in a different place, and we hadn't spent very much time together as a band. Nash was dating an international rock star for a year and basically disappeared. He was jet setting the entire time. I'm not going to say, but part of the reason the Exit the Dragon sounds the way it did is because the songs really were written more in isolation or really in the studio. And we were less seeing eye to eye on things. And, I had made a really hard decision that we did Saturation, and therefore this record is going to sound nothing like Saturation, which I will say was maybe kind of a dumb thing to do commercially. Now, our hardcore fans, and many of them, I think it's a real portrayal of where we were at the time and is an artistic success. But it was too much on its head. And with maybe it's an album, maybe with a different lead singer even. And that's not what like a record company knows what to do with, you know, and people just didn't quite, people wanted more saturation. You know, Nash kind of didn't have much to say because he was literally on a party trip with Chrissie Hynde, which was great. I'm sure he had the greatest time of his life, but showed up and it was sort of like, Nash, what do you got? And it was basically nothing. And we had to scramble. And the results are, you know, a record that sounded more like exactly what I wanted. And it was an attempt to not sound like saturation, which maybe we should have done 2 saturations and then gone to the next one. I don't know. But it was a completely different situation. And the studio had moved. The Butcher Brothers weren't, things had changed for them. They maybe didn't have such a chummy relationship. They bought a huge building with way too much square footage in the suburbs. It leaked. We were staying in a suburban hotel while we were making it. So everything changed, and probably not in a great way for the making of that record.
Like they're not like little bits like, oh, that's a fun little bit. Listen to how much fun they were having in the studio.
And when we weren't about to fake fun, and, you know, we were, I'm very proud that we made something that I consider an artistic success, and it's an honest, you know, portrait as there can be. As The Darkness was honest, We Came by Honestly and Exit the Dragon, the lightness and the light heart and the idea that everything's possible and the celebration in Saturation is the truth as well.
Yeah. I feel like Exit the Dragon is an album that sort of that holds up really well. And I think people sort of look back on that one now, as at least some do, or a bunch do. Certainly fans of Urge do, will say, oh, that's kind of this cool, dark record that at the time it was like, because people were expecting Saturation 2, it threw everyone off. But there's a grittiness and realness to it that I feel like.
Right. And most bands can't make a U-turn like that. And I guess we had a career of making, well, one song would often have very little to do with the next song. And I think it's not easy to love a band like that. A few people are going to love a band like that, but it's hard. It takes a few listens. And that is the kind of record that Exit the Dragon is. And I agree with you, and I appreciate that comment. And I think, yeah, that's a really easy footnote to sort of say, oh, Saturation was this success and Exit the Dragon was a failure, when actually what happened was the label were absolutely convinced that Saturation was going to be a multi-million selling, you know, smash hit. And they did everything they could. They gave us every budget we wanted. They all the advertising, everybody lined up behind. They truly loved that record. And perhaps it was a bit ahead of its time, or for whatever reason, that, you know, 300th, which would be a huge success today, was not considered the success that they expected. So by the time the next record came by that was really different, they were, even though there were people who understood Urge and loved that record, it was just kind of a thing where we threw everything at them with Saturation, and it didn't come out to be a dominating thing sales-wise. You know, culturally, it was successful. It was successful for us, but and I'm not going to complain about the numbers, and we were played on them, but it didn't reach the point where what a record company wants to see, where a band is launched and everybody knows about it. And they were so sure that that was going to happen that they sort of convinced us that that was going to happen. And when that didn't happen, really, I mean, we were sort of walking around after Saturation thinking this kind of wasn't really a success, when it just shows how twisted your perspective can get when actually it was a huge success that had to beat all these odds to even happen and to be as great as it did. And that's the irony there, is like we had this perceived success, and certainly every musician and every Urge fan was aware of it. But in terms of really breaking through to like really young people who like Stone Temple Pilots and don't even know why, what it's about, you need those people. You need like these 13-year-old kids to buy your records. And Urge was just a little bit too sophisticated, a little bit too early for that. And the humor, for whatever reason, wasn't as dumb as I love Weezer or whatever, but they kind of broke through in a way that they were on the same label as Urge. They thought Urge was going to be Weezer for sure. And Weezer was a total surprise. Oh, there was one guy who sort of came from the mailroom who's like, this is a great, band. And no, they are a great band. And they did work their way up. But there were a couple other things that happened after Saturation that did so much better that no one expected. And the label actually didn't even really care about, Counting Crows. That kind of upset things for us timing wise. And that's part of the story that I guess isn't told, that I just sort of only recently figured out after years of thinking about it.
Right. And then you had the Pulp Fiction thing, 94, the year after Saturation, taking an older Neil Diamond cover.
Right.
So that boosted your profile, albeit for not the record you just put out.
Right. And sort of not the same. It's a version of the band that had really passed, or it was, I guess, for us, it was not representative of where we wanted to go, but it was by far the biggest. So this happens to bands. Their one-hit wonder is at least it wasn't a gag, or what's the word for it? Joke song or something.
Novelty.
It wasn't that, but in terms of its effect on the band internally and people's idea of the band, it wasn't maybe the greatest thing. It's not a script we would have written. And that continued to make things weirder going into the next record.
So it didn't help. It actually hurt to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're better off for it having happened. And it did. It's good to be in a movie and you get paid for it. So financially, it was great. But I think it did set the band on, things had already gotten pretty dark. And I think the confusion of, that song now being the song, especially internationally, that's what people thought Urge Overkill was not what we would have liked. But that's a good point. And thanks for bringing it up. There was the Pulp Fiction thing in there, which was very important and a whole different story. That was just a glorious, fun thing that happened. I mean, if you'll notice, none of those songs are newer bands. I think they wanted to have the Neil Diamond version in there. And when Neil heard that it was going to be played over an overdose scene, he told them, I don't want this. Don't use my song in the movie. This is one story that we got. This is the one that I happen to believe. And then they realized miraculously, somebody was like, there's another version that sounds pretty much the same. And that's when they got a hold of us. Now, I think there's some other spin on the classic tale of, it was discovered by, maybe the song was brought to mind because the director, Tarantino, was telling a story that, I found this Urge record in Amsterdam and it had this Girl You'll Be a Woman suit on. Perhaps he did, and that's how he knew about the song. The song was a hit in Europe, but it was not a well-known song here. I think we did benefit from the fact that Neil Diamond didn't, and what supports my theory is that all of the music on the soundtrack is old, except for Urge. And Urge just happens to sound old because we used tape and we used old-fashioned machinery to record it. That's what we had. We recorded it with Kramer. and he put this old-fashioned piano on it, and it worked. It's creepier for the movie, actually, than Neil Diamond's actual version, by far.
Yeah, and you got that twangy, tremolo-y guitar on there.
Yeah, it's auto-tune, and yeah, everything's just barely... we played the song a couple of times. We had no copy of the song, and it was sort of a last-minute thing because we were out of songs that somebody had purchased that at a used record store, and we didn't even have a reference of the song. When we recorded Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon, it was from memory, and we just were sort of like, well, you couldn't just bring it up on the internet. We didn't have a copy of it. We just kind of played it. And that's why it sounds like it's falling apart. It's because we weren't really serious. It was just kind of like, well, this is a great song. And once we started going on it, Kramer, who had got into it, he's like, you guys, this is your hit. We're like, what are you talking about? He's like, this has something. So then once we recorded it, we put some time into it, and he put a piano on it, and we had a toy piano that we put on it. But that was sort of at Kramer's suggestion that we actually made it as good as it was. His weird proclamation turned out to be true. Because at the time, Urge wasn't the kind of band that would have a hit. It's like, what are you even talking about? We're like this punk rock band. We're on Touch and Go. There's no hits. He's like, this song is a hit, I'm telling you. He was so high. He had one of those, those things you used to smoke with a mask. Like he was doing that constantly recording our record. So some people can get away with it, I guess.
Wow. Making weed, like anything about like sort of the process of making weed and how that was different or updated for,
it's
now.
Nowadays you could take something from years ago and alter it, and it's not so hard to locate. We was kind of constructed from some bones of how people do things nowadays, completely different, where you've got a hard drive with all your stuff on it, and that can give you inspiration to sort of change things or use something that's maybe a drum track that's 10 years old even, and write a whole song over it, and it sounds great. You have your material at hand. It's not boxed up in some tape, and you have to go get it and put it on the tape machine. And so we were able to do it because the technology has changed so much. The band has people who want our stuff. We're working on more material. We've got T-shirts out there. I believe there may be some demand for the medallions, but I know the UO logo T-shirt, which we sort of ran out of and couldn't find just the regular UO, like the Kurt Cobain one, that is newly reproduced, if you care to. We called it Hot Dog Fever, but we couldn't find the Hot Dog Fever photo on the back. But those in the know, they'll know what the Hot Dog Fever photo looks like.
Any performances coming up, or is that on ice?
I can say that at this point, they're only in the planning stages, so I've got no concrete. We have offers to play, and I think right now we're considering our options. But I'm very happy that the last record got some good mentions, and I was even happy to see one of the guys who does cooking for the New York Times said that he was doing some cooking to the new Urge album. But for me to get any mention in the New York Times is great for me. That's just the kind of guy I am. But
there you go.
It didn't make headlines, but it made the New York Times. I'm happy.
Awesome. Well, it's a good record too. It sounds like you guys still. So
yeah, I was kind of amazed to the degree, but we had basically forever to think about it, and I'm glad we did get it right. Especially, we had everything ready to go. Then there was a snafu over the artwork, which took forever to get right, but I think it is right now. And it may not be forever till the next Urge record, but I guess you'll have to tune in elsewhere to get updated on that.
Thank you so much, Eddie. It's great talking to you. I appreciate it.
Good luck with podcast.
That's all for episode 88 of Caropop. Thanks so much to Eddie King Roeser for telling such vivid stories of the making of Urge's timeless breakthrough album and for taking us back to that great rock year of 1993. Celebrate the 30th anniversary of Saturation by buying it on vinyl or CD. And you can also download and stream it. Urge's latest album, We, that's the French word, also is widely available. Go to urgeoverkill.com to buy merch and listen to the music. Caropop is produced by Chris Swake, who knows everything don't need to be the same. I'm Mark Caro. Please follow Caropop on Twitter at CaroPopcast. You can follow me as well at Mark Caro at MarkCaro. Also, visit the Caropop website, caropop.com, where you can find this podcast and enter your email address so you'll hear about upcoming episodes and events. Please share this episode, subscribe, tell your friends, and tune in again next week for another Caropop conversation. Thanks.